مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. دعت وسائل إعلام أمريكية وأوروبية الولايات المتحدة لإنهاء مقاضاة جوليان أسانج مؤسس موقع ويكليكس. وناشدت وسائل الإعلام التي شاركت في نشر مواد مؤسس موقع ويكليكس ناشدت الحكومة الأمريكية بإسقاط التهم الموجهة إليه، حيث يواجه الحكم بالسجن لمدة قد تصل إلى 175 عاما. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا الأستاذ كيفن غوستولا، الكاتب ورئيس التحرير في موقع شادووبروف. أستاذ كيفن مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you.
أخيرا إذن تحركت وسائل الإعلام الغربية وهي الآن تطالب بإنهاء محاكمة جوليان أسانج. نذكر هنا أنها شاركت في نشر المواد أو محتوى ويكليكس. لماذا الآن؟ لماذا لم تنتفض سابقا وسائل الإعلام الأمريكية والغربية لحماية زميل في المهنة؟
Yeah, we've seen in the United States and all of Europe and then also Australia that for the most part, they haven't made it a priority up until recent months to end the prosecution of Julian Assange. Now, media organizations in these countries condemned the US Justice Department for indicting Julian Assange, but we haven't seen regular coverage of the case, which has been a major extradition case in the United Kingdom. And I think some of that has to do with journalists not believing that Julian Assange is a publisher who is like them, who is worthy of protection. They think that they do something differently, that WikiLeaks is not journalism, even though, as was laid out by Julian Assange's defense during the extradition proceedings in particular, they showed that WikiLeaks engaged in standard news gathering. They received documents from a source that was a US Army analyst, an intelligence analyst named Chelsea Manning, who shared these military documents, these US State Department documents with WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks looked through those documents. They came to media organizations around the world, and then they published those documents. And those documents were turned into stories that could help the people of several countries learn the truth about what US diplomats were doing behind the scenes and what was unfolding in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
هل باعتقادك محاكمة أسانج تمثل تهديدا لعمل الصحافة الاستقصائية حول العالم؟
What the United States government is doing is sending a signal to other countries around the world that if they don't like when a media organization, whether it be a traditional, a more conventional type of media organization, or a newer media organization that harnesses new types of technologies, maybe uses a new platform that people are using. What they're saying is, if you want to target someone or a group of people who are publishing secret documents or sensitive documents about what is going on in military or intelligence matters, going on in diplomatic relations, then you could target those people. You could retaliate. You could prosecute them and go after and try and punish them for engaging in freedom of expression or freedom of the press. And I think it's very alarming. The US is using a law that is over 100 years old in the United States to go after someone who isn't even a US citizen. Julian Assange is from Australia. Why should he have to obey a law from the United States? Why should anybody in any country in any part of the world have to obey a United States law?
وهنا أود أن أسألك، عندما تقترب بعملك من مصدر المعلومات أو تقترب كثيرا، هل تصبح أنت أيضا متواطئا في هذه الحالة؟
In the case of Assange and WikiLeaks, they didn't actually know who the source was of the information beyond the fact that in this, when we're looking at the criminal charges from the US government, they knew it was coming from within the US military, but they didn't know who this was. And, it wasn't exactly clear until they chatted with the source that they were upset about the wars. But at the same time, when they went through the material, it was on them to do what all journalists and media organizations do, which is to authenticate the documents, prove that they were real, and that they, in fact, did come from the US military and were not fakes, and that then when they published them, they would be able to stand up in front of the world and say, these are documents that expose the truth and reality of US wars. These are documents that show exactly how diplomats try to get their way with different countries, strong arm them, persuade them, say, if you don't do this, we're going to do this to you if you don't go along with us.
في ضوء ما ذكرت، هل سيحظى أسانج بمحاكمة عادلة في الولايات المتحدة؟
It'll be very difficult for Julian Assange to have a fair trial in the United States because the court where people are prosecuted for these types of crimes will likely have a jury that is composed of people from national security or intelligence agencies in the United States, possibly from the military, that is who lives in these communities in this area, or it'll be a judge who it's built into the court to be favorable to the intelligence agencies, to the CIA in particular. We already have evidence that has been brought out by American journalists as well as Spanish journalists that there was a private security company that was engaged in an operation that was spying on the Ecuador embassy in London. And we have evidence from this reporting that suggests that the CIA was supportive of this security company. And so they'll be able to, the judge is going to keep certain evidence out of the courtroom. The courtroom will be limiting what Julian Assange's defense can say about why he published the documents. And we won't get the full defense that we deserve. He won't be able to put on a full defense. He will have to really submit to a lot of the claims that the US government makes about him that are not based in truth.
أسانج في السجن الآن لأكثر من 3 سنوات. هل فكرة أن الولايات المتحدة تتجنب فعليا محاكمته مقبولة أو معقولة بالنسبة إليك، بالنظر إلى أن هكذا محاكمة ستحدث نوعا من الجدل وستجلب صورة سيئة للولايات المتحدة؟
It's taken this long to prosecute Julian Assange because they have to extradite him from the United Kingdom to the United States. And there's a very long, drawn-out process that is available for someone who is a defendant like Julian Assange to challenge being extradited. And they've made use of that. And in fact, they won. Julian Assange won back in January 2021 because the judge found that extraditing him to the US would be oppressive for mental health reasons. He's been deteriorating in Belmarsh prison, the jail, and where he's been detained. And yet then after an appeals process, the US government was able to win. And now it shifts back to Assange challenging in the court the fact that he's being extradited and saying that his rights to freedom of the press are being violated. So the reason why Julian Assange has not been extradited is not necessarily because the United States is hostile to him, although the fact that they won't drop charges against Julian Assange shows they are hostile. But the reason Julian Assange is in limbo, this legal limbo, he's just in this prison and has not been brought to the US for trial yet, is because he's still trying to prevent himself from being in a US prison or entering a US courtroom where he would certainly be convicted.
أسانج أسترالي، لماذا لم تدعمه حكومته؟
Yes, I think this is a very critical issue. Why should Julian Assange have to obey the United States Espionage Act? Why should anybody, in the African continent, in Europe, in Asia, South America, all over the world, why should they have to obey what the United States says is acceptable under the Espionage Act. This is a law that should only be applied to Americans, and even that is a big debate in the United States over whether the Espionage Act should be used in the manner in which it's being used, which is to say that the US government can prosecute somebody for publishing classified information when the New York Times, the Washington Post, all these other newspapers were sharing the documents. They did exactly what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did. So he is being treated like a second-class citizen or a third-world citizen. He's being treated like somebody whose human rights are secondary. And despite the fact that the US State Department wants to tell all countries around the world how they should treat their citizens and protect human rights, how they should allow everyone to be able to engage in democracy and have freedom of expression, they are failing. The US government under President Joe Biden is failing to live up to this standard by continuing the prosecution against Julian Assange.
الضغوط المتزايدة على بايدن لإسقاط التهم الموجهة إلى جوليان أسانج، هل من الممكن أن توصل الأمور إلى نقطة تحول قد تؤدي إلى إطلاق سراحه؟
So far in the US, we do not see any signal that the Biden White House or the State Department or the Justice Department, and the person who runs the Justice Department in the US, his name is he's Merrick Garland. It's Attorney General Merrick Garland. We see no evidence that they are backing off despite the concerns that have been expressed. And mind you, these things that have been said in protest against charging Julian Assange have been global. We have seen press freedom, human rights organizations around the world raising alarm about what it would mean for journalists all over the world if the US continues to prosecute and convicts Julian Assange of what they have alleged that he did. And we see no change in their commitment, even though there's all this information available to the Justice Department to show them that they should drop the case and not pursue it any further.
الرئيس البرازيلي لولا دا سيلفا طالب بإنهاء ما أسماه السجن الجائر لأسانج. هل البرازيل قادرة على التأثير في هذه القضية؟ وماذا يمكن أن يفعل داعمو أسانج حول العالم لمساندته؟
What we should do is recognize that people who are journalists all over the world could be next if they are engaged in any work that is similar at all to what Julian Assange has been accused of doing when it comes to publishing the documents. So you mentioned Lula in Brazil. There have been other leaders from Latin America. There have been leaders throughout the global South who have spoken up. Someone who has been remarkable to hear protest this prosecution because they are in a bordering country of the United States is Obrador, President Obrador in Mexico, who has had meetings with Joe Biden where he has said that he opposes the prosecution of Julian Assange. There are other leaders in South America who have joined Lula in opposing this. There are some parliamentarians in different European countries who have spoken up against the prosecution. We don't really see this in the United States, but I think if we're going to see the US back off the prosecution of Assange, it's going to have to be embarrassing to the US government to continue the prosecution. And that's only going to be felt if more world leaders, and we're also hearing calls in Australia to end the prosecution from the Prime Minister, who's no longer that supportive of what the US government is doing. And so if we could continue to see these world leaders step up and say that they do not support what the US government is doing, eventually they might feel shame and decide that they're going to get on the side of human rights and democracy.
أستاذ كيفن غوستولا، شكرا للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you. Bye.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.